Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners, or actually good morning, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. It is mid-November and the weather is relatively crisp. The temperature thing inside our house said it was in the high 30s, but it feels warmer than that to me, so I don't know. Maybe it hasn't been updated recently. I'm out today to take a little bit of a walk before I settle in for a long day of meetings and emails and grading. It's going to be a hoot. So let's just get into it. Glad to see you. So I was thinking about this because, as I said, it's going to be a long day of emails and meetings and stuff. And right now in my job, I am experiencing what I would call the challenge of juggling complexity, that I have a lot of plates spinning and I'm working to keep them all spinning in a variety of different tasks that all need to get done. And it's hard to find enough time in the day to get them all done and keep them moving. So that is the current challenge I'm facing in work. So even though I find that really fun in gaming, I don't find it fun in work. It's real stressful. But I'm also particularly stressed out this morning because my computer died twice this morning with the kind of error that looks like it's the computer is dying for good error. And it's a very inconvenient time for me to have my desktop PC fail on me. So that's very stressful as well. I do have a laptop so I can attend my meetings and do my work meetings today, but it's if it turns out my desktop is dead or so significantly dead enough that I have to do repair work on it, I'm going to be real sad. And it feels like that is the case. So, okay, so juggling. So my topic today, now that you're done with the sad Brendan tiny violin playing, is that I want to talk about juggling complexity. I've been thinking about this since I went to my design partner Rob's game day and good friend game day or game weekend recently, and I got to play a couple games that really hit this spot for me. And so I thought it would be fun to talk about the idea of juggling complexity. So I've often mentioned, if you've listened to the podcast for a long time, that my favorite feeling, my favorite experience in a game is, just not enough. That's what I call it. The idea that you have a game where the different mechanisms are in place in such a way that you get to a point where you feel this sort of crisis of decision because you just don't have quite enough to do it and you're trying to figure out how to get enough to do it. So I thought I would share a couple different versions of that feeling and get your feedback on them. Now, it's possible that I am splitting hairs too finely, and then what we're going to find is this is one hair that I've tried to cut into three. But I think it's worth talking about how these different effects in game design manifest and how they give me that feeling of, just not quite enough. Okay, so to start with, I think the first version of that I want to talk about is the idea of speed versus efficiency. And I've experienced this lately, and most often, recently anyway, in Arc Nova. Arc Nova is, of course, a very well-known tableau builder, engine builder that's come out recently or in the last couple years. And it's about building a zoo. And the big thing in it is that you have these cards, and the cards increase in power as they move up the action track. So if you take the one at the top of the action track, it's worth sort of 5 power. And if you take it when it's lower on the action track, it takes less. But then when you take it, it goes back to the bottom and now it's a 1. And each of the 5 cards that give you the 5 different actions you can do during the game can be upgraded. So there's really kind of 10 actions you can do, or 5 and then 5, a supercharged version of each of those. And with the power on them at higher levels, they give you access to more stuff, but some of them, they become more efficient in terms of, if you think of the game as having a limited number of turns, the animal card, for example, the one that lets you put animals into your zoo, if it's at level 5, you can put 2 animals into your zoo. But in order to do that, you have to have enough money to pay for them both, and you have to have enough enclosures built that you can literally put both animals into your zoo. So there's a really interesting trade-off there between the speed of, okay, I have one enclosure built, I'm going to put one animal in. It doesn't matter that I'm not up to the top of that track, that getting that engine going feels fast, but then you're using your turn to just do one thing. It's sort of incremental. And with some of those animals, the payoff, it's good, but it's not amazing. And so it feels better to me to use the animal card when it's on that 5 and be able to put 2 animals in. But often in order to do that, I have to take a couple suboptimal turns to either get enough money or get enough space or whatever. And perhaps it would be smarter for me to spread out those suboptimal turns into the animal thing too. And then I would be getting more income from having more animals on the board, right? So there's this efficiency balance. And so I think of the idea of speed versus efficiency, because at its heart, Ark Nova is a game where you're racing to get enough points to end the game, right? That unlike a lot of games where it has a set end time and the person who ends the game gives everyone else one more turn and then you do score, or there's a set number of rounds and the game ends and you all do your score. In Ark Nova, the game ends when somebody gets a high enough combination of the 2 different scoring tracks. And then once that happens, everybody gets one more turn, except the person who did it. So there's an interesting sort of chicken dance at the end as you're lining up your end game scoring points and trying to get to the point where when you take that last turn, you'll get as far ahead on the scoring track as you can, because if you're the one who ends the game, everybody else gets one more turn. And if you're not the one who ends the game, you need to be in a position to get past the person who does, which is often very hard because usually somebody ending the game knows they're doing it and they make a big play at the end. So there's this question of speed, racing to getting to an end point, versus efficiency of actions where you maybe go a little slower at the beginning, but because you've built up this efficiency, you get there. And I really love that tension, and that's part of what I like about Ark Nova. I'll also say I feel the speed versus efficiency thing in Praga Caput Regni, which is different because in Praga you have a set number of rounds, right? And so speed isn't as crucial, but there are some bonuses that you get if you're the first person, or you get first pick at them if you're going in a certain direction. And the spaces are all getting taken up. So it's a race to colonize. That's not a great word, but it's a race to take control of different spaces on the board, ideally faster than your opponents did, because you don't want them to get all the bonuses for taking control of those spaces. So Praga Caput Regni also has to me that feeling of maybe taking a couple actions to build up the efficiency of your later actions, but then being slower off the blocks in terms of taking things and getting bonuses and whatnot. That said, there's not a ton of that. I'm first here, I get the best thing in Praga. Praga has a strategic element where you're building these long-term goals, but it's also got a tactical element of what's available when it's your turn. And I think those two together make it a pretty good balance of different options. So speed versus efficiency is the first of the plates, or the first of the versions of juggling complexity that I wanted to mention today. The second one is one I'll call ducks in a row. Ducks in a row refers to the idea that a game uses a series of interconnected systems to set up different actions, and that in order to pursue those, you have to have, quote unquote, all your ducks in a row, right? You have to have everything lined up in order to take the action. I distinguish it. So Ark Nova, I just said, has that, right? If you want to play an animal, first you have to have the money to play the animal, then you have to have the required symbols, and you have to have a spot to put the animal. And so to do the animal placement, you have to have all these other things arranged. That's true. And most of these games do have similar things like that. The place I would say the difference is that I don't feel like in Ark Nova, the challenge is remembering to do all those things. It's just to get them in place. Whereas in the version of ducks in a row that I'm talking about, one of the mental challenges is setting up the chain of events that will allow you to do the thing you need to do, because the way that the things intervene is so complicated. And of course, if you haven't guessed it yet, I'm talking about Vital Lacerda games, particularly on Mars, but literally all of them that I've played use this method of complexity sometimes. On Mars is the one I feel it the most, because it feels like that's the one where it's the most often that I go to do a thing and I remember like, oh dang, I needed to do these 2 other things first in order to be able to do this thing, right? You need to make sure you have the right fuel, and you need to make sure you have the space available and the workers available, and that blah, 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 right? There's all these interconnected systems, and in order for you to succeed, you have to jump into that interconnected flow and keep up with it. And I find that really exciting. And it is the feeling of, oh, just not quite enough. But instead of not quite enough time, which is what's going on in the speed versus efficiency versions, in this one it feels like not quite enough planning. Like, it is a game that challenges you to decide how far out you're going to plan, because each step of a process gains benefit from having planned for the previous step. And so at some point you do have to intervene with the less ideal. But like, by way of example, On Mars has these science advisor cards that you can get. And to get one takes a fair amount of work. You have to get the right resources and play into the right spot and have the right stuff available. I don't remember exactly. But then what you get when you get the science advisor is you get a little spiff on something else you're doing. Maybe you get an extra action, maybe you get an extra resource every time you do a thing. It's an increase in efficiency and it's sort of a bonus. But then in order to make most use of that, then you have to plan more in order to execute the plan with that efficiency at the right time. And then once you get that new bonus, now that new bonus provides you a benefit, but in order to make the most use of it, you have to plan even more ahead. So the challenge in Vital Lacerda is deciding when do you give up on the planning and just move ahead, which is kind of speed versus efficiency a little bit. But to me, the really crucial and delightful challenge in it is that moment, is that trick of trying to get all the ducks in a row in order to, I don't know what the follow-up is on. If all your ducks are in a row, then what? You can go swimming? When someone says get your ducks in a row, I don't know what the actual metaphor is, right? Like I understand the meaning of get your ducks in a row, but I don't understand the definitional purpose of that meaning. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure it does, but to me it makes sense. So that is Juggling Complexity, ducks in a row. The other game that I would say does that really well is Underwater Cities. Because in Underwater Cities, in order to build things, you almost always need two different resources. At least like the tunnels and the cities both take multiple resources. So you're constantly thinking about like spending those resources, producing those resources, having them available, getting them. Also which cards you have, what order you're going to trigger your cards in. Are you going to be able to make use of one of the spaces that matches the color of your card so you can use your card and the space? There is an awful lot of planning, an awful lot of sequential planning that has to go into making things happen in Underwater Cities. That said, I think Underwater Cities has a kind of a level of forgiveness that I don't feel is there in On Mars. I think in Underwater Cities you can find a way around to resources you're missing without nearly as much penalty as you get from something like On Mars. That might not be true. That might just be my impression. But I think Underwater Cities does really fit that ducks in a row idea as well. So the third kind of not quite enough. So the first one was not quite enough time to act. The second one, like I'm trying to get things done quickly because you're trying to get things done even quicker. So we're racing, right? Not quite enough speed is maybe the word I'm looking for there. The second one is not quite enough planning or not quite enough organization. Well, the third one of not quite enough would be time. Now you see why I went back and revised that earlier one. So in this case, what I mean to say is time to prepare for the known problems. And the classic of this for me is Agricola. And part of what makes Agricola amazing is that you have to feed your workers, feed your people. And you have to feed your people a not insignificant amount of food, right? That the premise is that you're a medieval subsistence farmer in the area that would eventually be Germany. And subsistence farming meant growing enough food for your family to subsist, meaning survive. And the whole point of Agricola is you slowly over the time get more efficient and generate more value for your farm. But you always have to keep minding the food. And the game makes you take begging cards for every point of food you're not able to feed your family, which is devastating. I mean, a really good score in Agricola is 60 points, and that's a really good score. I've often won with points in the 40s. If I have a game where I get into the 50s, I consider it a very good game. And a begging card is 3 points lost, meaning if you got an excellent score of 60, that begging card is 5% of your score. If you're only getting 40 points, it's closer to 10%, right? So the -3 card is really, and if you haven't been paying attention enough to take one begging card, chances are you're taking 2 or 3. But so the way the Agricola works is at the end of these seasons, and at the beginning you get four. I think you get 4 rounds before the season hits, and then it gets closer together as it goes along. You have to feed your people. You have to spend 2 food per person, and if you have a child, a character that was just created that round, it's only 1 food. So in the first round, or at the end of the first 4 rounds, you have to have 4 food saved up in order to feed your people. And it just gets worse as you get more people. You can have a total of 5 people, meaning you have to have 10 food to spend, some cases every 2 or 3 rounds, which means you have to have a food engine going. You have to be growing crops and baking bread, or you have to be harvesting animals or whatever. There's a variety of different ways you can feed your people, but you have to be able to do it. And with the complexity of Agricola and the fun of planning for turn-based efficiencies and acquiring goods and setting up things, I find it really hard to remember to feed my people. It's very easy to get to the second to last or even the last worker in the round before harvest, and then you realize, like, oh dang, I forgot to think about food, and then your whole game is tanked. So that's to me, that is a fascinating and crucial part of the game, especially because if you're not doing well, it's really easy to just spend all of your turns getting food and never really advancing your farm very much, which I think is an amazing bit of development. Now, of course, Uwe Rosenberg, especially in his early games, was really good at this, and it was a really big part of his games. He does it in Caverna as well, but it's easier to dodge the trouble in Caverna. In games like Reykholt, or I think At the Gates of Loyang, although I have not played that, in that one, you're developing goods, and you have to kind of have the goods in a certain order, and if you don't have them, then you can't sort of move forward to the next one. So there's an interesting give and take on those things, and I like that. I think it works really well. The other game where I feel this pressure, and actually I feel it more, I think it is more dramatic in this game than it is in Agricola, is Tricarion. In Tricarion, you have to pay your workers, and if you can't pay them, you lose points. The point penalty is not quite as harsh as Agricola, but it's not nothing. And that's a key part of the game because money is relatively scarce. Now, especially if you screw up and you don't get a good performance, you might get toward the end of the round and really not have much money, and you have to waste an action going to get money. You also have to spend your money on the goods to make the tricks that you're going to perform in your magic show, and that's money that you were going to use to pay your people. So it is a really tight economy game that's really fun and really interesting, but very difficult. Again, because you're thinking of so many other things, it's really easy to get to that moment when you have to pay your workers and be like, oh, I totally forgot about paying my workers. Oh dang, here is all of the penalty that I'm getting now because I was focused on points or focused on acquiring new materials or whatever. So the feeling of not quite enough time to resolve the pressure, not quite enough time, emerges for me in things like Agricola and Tricarion, and that's part of what I really like about those games. Now, at the game day, I had an opportunity to play 2 games that for me both embody the not quite enough feeling. On the one hand, you have Brass, which is very much, to me, a game of speed versus efficiency and ticking clock. The ticking clock there, or ducks in a row, I mean. Speed versus efficiency versus ducks in a row. Because to get everything ready to sell something in Brass, you have to kind of get all of these different pieces in place and be watching the other players so that you make sure to do it in a way that they don't steal away your stuff. On the other hand, you also have the ticking clock of, you have the question of speed versus efficiency in terms of like, you want to try to sell 2 goods in one turn? That takes a lot more coordinating, especially if you're selling goods that require beer, which is what you're playing Brass Birmingham. The other option is to try and set things up before the other pressure is the end of the game, right? The game is played in 2 rounds. There are not that many cards. I think you get, 15 turns or something on maybe 8 turns on each half of the game. It's very quick and it's delightful, but really intense. So Brass and Brass Birmingham are one of those games that make me feel that way. The other one that I played recently was Orleans. Now, Orleans doesn't have quite the same kind of pressures, but the big thing is the pressure of deciding what to push for and when. The challenge of pulling the token, getting the right tokens, pushing for the right goals, focusing your points. It all works out in a really interesting way. And there are a number of different levers you have to pull to try to get to the end state. And you always feel like you just don't have quite enough stuff to do it. And I love that. So Orleans would be another example of this feeling. So what games do you play that you would talk about as being about juggling complexity. Which ones that I mentioned are your favorites? Which ones would you like to try? Which ones do you think I should try? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know your thoughts on those games. And I look forward to talking to you about it there. Thanks for joining me in my walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.